Welcome to our interview series on brave feminine leadership. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce everyone to Laura Kray. Laura, welcome to the conversation.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. I'm really excited to be here.
So I am going to step through Laura's bio firstly, just so everyone's got a bit of an understanding about you and why I'm so excited to have you as part of our conversation. So Professor Laura Kray is the Ned and Carroll Spieker Professor of Leadership at the Walter A. Haas School of Business, University of California at Berkeley, where she's been on the faculty since 2002. Kray is an expert on the role of gender stereotypes and mindsets about gender on workplace behaviour, including negotiations, leadership and ethical decision-making. Her work's been supported by the National Science Foundation and has been recognised with multiple Best Research Awards from the Academy of Management and International Association of Conflict Management. Her research has been featured in a wide range of media outlets, including Washington Post, New Yorker, National Public Radio, Harvard Business Review, New York Times, Financial Times, Slate, Forbes, Huffington Post, Daily Beast, Scientific American, Business Week and Time.com. In 2008, Laura founded the Women's Executive Leadership Program of Berkeley Executive Education, and she's been the faculty director ever since. Currently, she's the faculty director of Berkeley Haas's Centre for Equity, Gender and Leadership and editor of the Research in Organisational Behaviour Journal. In 2018, she was elected a fellow to both the Association for Psychological Science and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. From 2017 to 18, she was a fellow at the Centre for Advanced Study in the Behavioural Sciences at Stanford University, where she launched her current research on debunking common myths about the gender pay gap. Oh, Laura, so much for us to get into.
Thank you for that introduction, Melissa.
Laura, can I ask, for people in the audience who haven't had the pleasure of coming across you before, can I ask you to start and perhaps take us through who you are and why you are who you are?
Absolutely. Yeah. So what you see is what you get. I am an academic by training, and that's where my passion lies. I've always been a student since, I started kindergarten and went straight through from undergrad studying psychology at the University of Michigan. And towards the end of my undergraduate studies, started thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I just remember seeing one of my professors, Professor Frank Gates, I had a couple classes with him in judgment and decision-making. I saw him walking across the center of campus. They call it the diag. And there was just something I saw and I said, I want to do what he's doing. And I reached out to him and, he gave me an opportunity to start doing research. And I, started working with other faculty as well. And I just knew it was exactly what I wanted to do. And so then I applied to graduate school and decided to go to the University of Washington. And so went straight through from undergrad to graduate school and had an absolute blast in graduate school. I knew it was, I've always loved school and, on top of just what I had experienced up until then in school, which is, book learning, this was what questions interest you and how can we figure out how to answer those questions in the most rigorous and, sort of convincing way. And so I got my PhD in psychology. And then from there, I did dabble in working in tech while I was finishing up my PhD. And while it was a great experience, it also just further confirmed for me that I actually like college campuses and whatnot. So even though I love Seattle and being there, I said, if I want to pursue this track, I need to relocate. And so I went and did a postdoc at Northwestern University at the Kellogg Graduate School of Management. So that is where I learned to be a business school professor. Okay. And, and I started teaching a class on negotiations. And that was really my first, sort of foray into, training business students, future business leaders, and also starting to get a glimpse of some of the gender dynamics that play out in the classroom as well as in the workplace.
What led you into the negotiation space in the first place?
Well, some of it is, as a social psychologist, there's a high demand for, decision making. Negotiations is really joint decision making, right? And so there's so much psychology to it. So as far as, teaching in a business school, it's a common class that psychologists teach. And so, one of my mentors from graduate school, Lee Thompson, she had taught me about negotiations, and she was a very prominent negotiation scholar. So it just it wasn't something planned. It was an opportunity that I was given, and I ended up really being fascinated by it. And now 24 years later, I'm still studying it.
Fantastic. So there you are, you're teaching negotiation. How did that path lead you, more broadly to where you are today, where there's a real gender lens on all of that?
Yeah, so it's sort of a funny story because, kind of broader background information about me is I grew up in a family with 4 girls, and all within 6 years of each other, and I'm the third in line. And so, my mom and dad, very traditional, sort of intact family. My dad, the breadwinner, but because I didn't have brothers and there were so many of us, girls around, I had no awareness whatsoever of like gender being an issue, out there. And, some of my friends who grew up with brothers, they'd say, well, he got to stay out this late and I had to be home by this time. And I just didn't have any experience with any of that. So it wasn't even on my radar at all to think about gender. And it was actually a student in the class the very first time I taught it, where, a lot of the textbook learning about negotiations is about these heuristics and biases. And, people can be overconfident or, anchoring on a particular reference point without considering other reference points. And so it's just very, this is how the brain works, and this is how we interact with other people. And a woman in the class raised her hand and said, Professor Kray, could you, this is all well and good what you're teaching us, but I'm just curious, what difference does gender make? I was like deer caught in the headlight because I literally hadn't thought about it. I'm, embarrassed to say, but it was also part of the zeitgeist of the time because so what did I do in that moment? I said, that's a great question. Here's what I'm going to ask you all to do. I want to know what you think the role of gender is. So I'm going to give you a homework assignment, and I want you to write an essay on the role of gender, and I will compile it, and we'll have a conversation about this in the next class. So I stalled effectively. And then after the class, I, have a number of colleagues around who were mentors and experts in negotiation. So I did go up to one of my male mentors, a very famous negotiation scholar. And I said, do you ever get this question? Like, how do you answer it? And his answer was, I say, that's not an interesting question. And I was like, okay. And, I think I just knew intuitively what he didn't finish saying is, it's not an interesting question to me.
Yes.
Right. And so from there, I thought, I think it, so then we compiled the data from the class and found that, basically there's a stereotype that exists that suggests, people think that men are better negotiators than women. And right around that time, Claude Steele, who actually was the first psychologist I ever took a undergraduate social psychology class with at Michigan, he had since moved to Stanford, and he was doing this great work on stereotype threat, which is this idea that when you are a member of a negatively stereotyped group, whether it be, women in math, here we have women in negotiations, you can, racial stereotypes about academic achievement, just knowing that stereotype exists can create a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because in that moment of, let's say we're talking about gender and math, here I am taking the really difficult math exam that's going to get me into a top graduate program. If I'm in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I know women can't do this, or people think women can't do this. At a minimum, it's taking up some of my cognitive energy, right? My working memory capacity is being stressed, so that instead of just focusing on the math problem in front of me, I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm gonna, sort of choke, and I'm gonna prove this stereotype correct. And so that in and of itself can lower my expectations. It can, lead women to give up more easily. So, there's this dynamic, and I was able to show in laboratory experiments that, when you put men and women into a negotiation and you subtly, sort of say either, this is it, this is the negotiation that's going to prove your worth and, predict how you're going to do in all future negotiations, raise the stakes where the pressure is really on. That's where you get women settling for less than their male counterparts. But when that message is not elevated, right? When you say you're going to do this identical negotiation, and this is a learning tool, it's a way to get experience, men and women do identically. So,
wow.
So there's something about the power of the stereotype. And, obviously, once you get into a negotiation, you have to ask yourself, well, where's the difference coming from? Are women not trying as hard? Are men, sort of pushing harder? What's going on in the high stakes situation? And because we were able to capture, before they actually went into the negotiation, what are your aspirations? We could see that just raising the stakes where this stereotype is in the air lowers women's aspirations. So
what do people do? What do people do with that in sort of practical terms?
Well, you need to be aware that this is, an additional burden that you're shouldering, and then counteract it, right? So there's a whole host of, sort of techniques that practices, sort of hacks, so to speak, that you can engage in before to psych yourself up. And one of them that's very effective is just called self-affirmation, right? So just connecting with, what are your core values, right? And so before I go into this high pressure negotiation over, salary or what have you, I'm going to remind myself that, the most important value in life for me is integrity, is, truth. And it doesn't matter what it is. It could be my most important value is friendships and, connecting to people. My most important value is, economic gain, whatever it is, just reminding yourself of what that value is, provides a buffer against the threat in the environment, against psychological threats. So that's one example. And then another example that we actually showed in one of our first studies along these lines is, if you say, well, to be a good negotiator, you need to be rational and assertive and, have a high regard for your own interest, people can fill in the blanks and say, well, those are stereotypically masculine traits, right? And that can trigger stereotype threat as well. But if we add on to that, oh, by the way, men and women, people think men and women differ on these characteristics. That can trigger what we call stereotype reactance. And that can actually be a good thing for women, where they say, wait a second, you may think that's true of women, but it's certainly not true of me. It's the I'll show you effect. Mm-hmm. Right. So, and I hesitate to say that because certainly we don't want to go around endorsing negative stereotypes, but some of Angela Duckworth's research on grit is this idea. Even Michelle Obama, would talk about how that motivation to prove you wrong, your low expectations of me, can actually, sort of give people that stamina and will to overcome the negative stereotype.
So was that first research back in 2001? Was that the Battle of Sexes research that you did?
Yes.
What else did you find in that? And I guess at the end of it, did that professor you went to ever find the question interesting?
It's funny. I confronted him about it last year or 2 years ago. And because I was at a retirement party for somebody and I was asked to give a presentation, and I gave him a heads up and said, I may I don't know if you remember this. And he was like, oh, I don't remember that. But anyway, as it turned out, that was like a day or two before I actually gave the presentation, and I ended up going in a different direction. And so afterwards he came up to me and he's like, I was all prepared to like apologize and, talk about how far I've come since then. And I said, well, I guess I let you off the hook, but
I'll take that as a yes. He did find the question interesting.
That's right. Right. I think he understands. I don't know if he finds it interesting, but he understands the errors of his ways.
And why you've pursued so much research in the area.
Yeah, right. And I don't think, so some of what drives me and keeps me going in this area is I don't think he's unique, right? I mean, the sense of, by and large, most men, I find in my experience in my professional life, are not interested in these questions. It's disinterest, denial, right? So scrutinizing, are these real findings, or could this possibly be true? And that's just human nature. That's sort of obviously some of the work I do kind of puts men in the hot seat in terms of their ethics and in negotiations and, sort of how they use power and status. And so that can evoke defensiveness.
Can I ask you, just staying on these themes, one of the things about negotiation that really interested me, and I hear people talk about it in practical terms a lot, that as a female, if you're going in to advocate on behalf of others, the outcomes are very strong. If you're going in to advocate on behalf of yourself, less so.
That can, there's some research that speaks to that. So it's certainly harder for women to go in asking for a raise for themselves than to say, here's my team member who's underpaid and here's why he or she deserves a raise. And that's just consistent with gender stereotypes and gender roles and how we've been socialized, where women are supposed to be, taking care of other people. They're not supposed to be self-interested. And so when women are advocating on their own behalf, it can certainly be more pressure filled, right? So, maybe that creates stereotype threat. It can certainly, and it also can evoke backlash, right? Where the other side has a negative reaction and says, this woman is difficult, or, I don't want to work with her. So those are, sort of tricky problems.
What are the typical, kind of gender labels that you see sort of placed on women? What would you call out?
Certainly backlash is, oftentimes the B word, right? Like, she's a, what, and that women are, pushovers, that women are, either pushovers or difficult, right? It's the Goldilocks, right? She's not quite this, she's not quite that. You can't quite find, the acceptable middle ground if you're a woman. So those are real. And also, I guess in my own experience and in the teaching that I do, we also have to remember that some of that pushback is fleeting, right? It's really valuable to have thick skin. Not that I want to put the onus on women to, kind of have to shoulder these burdens on their own, but it's also, you have to be prepared, right? Just like any man or a woman. Here are the facts. Here are the numbers. Here are the comparables. Here's what my next best alternative is. And, you need to go in, having practiced this and, with a sense of determination. And also certainly appealing to the other side, right? It can't just be one-sided. Give me this, give me this. It has to be, framed in such a way that makes clear to the other side how it's also in their interest.
Hence the negotiation side.
Yeah.
So you've done this initial research in 2001. Where did that take you from there?
It's just been, one idea after another. Again, my graduate training was on decision making, and I did my dissertation on, how do people make decisions for themselves versus when they're giving advice to somebody else, and really had no gender angle to it whatsoever. And, got the question from the student, was curious, was also extra curious by my male colleagues' response, but I never, really made a decision like I'm going to, change my focus to gender. It always just was like, well, here's one more question. And here's one, let's see if, I'm interested in social cognition and, the thoughts and motivations that we have that are based on our identities. And I love studying social interaction. And, I've had people along the way, well-meaning people say to me, in my field, you will destroy your career if you keep studying gender or race, so again, there's that little bit of me that I guess is a rebel, and I'm like, I'm not gonna let people tell me what to do when I know what they're saying is just, it shouldn't be that way. Right. And I have enough, I'm willing to roll the dice, so to speak. I'm willing to assume the risks, because I think if you do good work and you do it in a way that is, not, political per se. I'm a scientist, right? I'm just trying to show the evidence that, it'll sink in and it'll have an impact. And then as I've progressed through my career, I've had more and more opportunities with graduate students and postdocs and, people who I feel really proud that, people who along the way have had these same sorts of pushback from their male advisors. And I know that, and they have told me they wouldn't have finished their PhD. They wouldn't be in the field still if it were not for me, because they came to me and I said, let's do it. Let's figure out a way to do it and have this be a side project, maybe not your dissertation. It's a side project, and see where it goes. And, over the last 20 years, and I don't take credit for, many people doing this work, but it is just, it has become more normal. It has become more accepted. And so I feel good about that.
There's so many things about that I love. I often think about, and you can back me up on whether the research suggests this, but what I hear reported from women is that, they have that internal voice that stops them from doing stuff. And then when that internal voice is maybe backed up by external forces, whether it be advisors or whatever, who are kind of echoing it, I just sometimes sit back and I think to myself, think of all the companies that wouldn't have started, or think of all the books that wouldn't have been written if people had kept listening to that voice. So, is there research on that voice?
Well, definitely. I mean, the voice isn't, there may be individual differences in terms of the narrative that we tell ourselves, but we have to remember, like, we are social beings. That voice, by and large, is coming to us through our culture, right? And subtly, often below the level of conscious awareness. So we think it's like, oh, this voice must be true. And so I think we all need to, teach our daughters and everybody really to, keep a journal. That's the best, right? Just keep the journal with, this is what she said to me, and that way one day you will have all the evidence in front of you where you're like, and then you can share that with somebody who's junior to you. Right. And say, you have to have a healthy detachment from other people's feedback. Feedback is great, but sometimes feedback is, you have to have that own, your own sense of discernment and truth. And
can we talk about the women's executive leadership program that I was incredibly lucky to be able to attend virtually? I had every intention of coming face to face, and unfortunately things conspired against us over the last 12 months. Tell me how that program, where did it come from, and what's it all about?
Yeah. So, again, one of my main areas of research and teaching is negotiation, but, I was teaching executives early on in my career, and, it's more often than not a room of let's say 80% men. And as I was becoming more and more interested in this topic of gender as it relates to negotiations, I found that I was almost apologetic about bringing it up, like to the class and trying to introduce it and have a discussion around gender, because again, it's this denial and disinterest that, men as a group have traditionally, you say gender and everybody thinks woman, it's about women, where it's actually about men and women. Or you say feminism and people think bias, yes, right? Like not rigorous, right? And so I'm trying to have a serious conversation. And even though in the negotiations, literature and training, the idea of like cross-cultural negotiations, which is like this group of people who are this way and this group of people who are this way, people love that, but somehow gender was like, I couldn't quite work it in edgewise. And so that's when I said, I know that people, like, there's an audience for this. And so we need to create something that allows these conversations to happen. And so then I, also thinking more broadly, it's not just about negotiations, it's about networking, it's about social influence, it's about leadership styles. And so I basically ran through my Rolodex of, top faculty at Berkeley who, by and large are also research faculty. So I wanted it to be evidence-based, science-backed, cutting edge, and, put this program together of a 4-day experience. And, when we first started it, it was, we had to build demand, right? And yeah. So it would be like, okay, maybe there's some women on campus who are staff who want to, attend. And, we practiced, we made mistakes, we, sort of refined it. And then, fast forward, I guess 13 years now. And it's just the most delightful experience to have people from around the globe coming, multiple times a year and really just hunkering down and, trusting us and learning from each other. And, I forget because, this is what I do and this is the research that I do. So I know how much, gender bias is out there, et cetera. So it's really amazing to me when, women come to this, and often with trepidation. And I don't know if I want to be in a women's program as opposed to how's women's leadership different. And I say, these are all leadership skills that are important for everybody, but it tends, we need to carve out the space to talk about gender. And it's just amazing to see women, quite successful women in their careers who we've all had these same, sort of gender-based experiences where really for the first time, some of them are realizing that this is not personal. This is something that transcends all of us, and it's structural, it's, baked into the system. And although that can be a rude awakening and, sort of depressing on one level, it's also liberating because it's not personal. It's not about you. It's about, society. And we have to stay in the game. We have to be knowledgeable, and we have to, get our game on, to navigate these obstacles. And then we need to strengthen our desire for leadership so that when we are in positions where we can affect change, we know what to do and we're ready to act.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And it's interesting, what you said about people realizing maybe for the first time how structural so much of this is, including the mindset, including that voice and where that's kind of come from. I think for a lot of people, it's the first time they sit back and question that even the fact that I'm saying to myself, you're not good enough, or you can't do this, or people don't do those things. All of that has come from a structural place.
Yeah, well. Absolutely. Yeah, right. It's it's an accumulation of experiences and, sort of how we have been treated, how, any shortcomings have been interpreted. And so, as a big sort of theme that's woven throughout the program is one of growth mindset. And, this is Carol Dweck's theory about, believing that people can change, right? And it's so powerful, not just because, keep your chin up and stay positive and things can get better, but also because it fundamentally changes, kind of how we are and how we experience vulnerability. And, so, for me, like teaching is something that, I'm more introverted actually. And so standing in front of a room of people and kind of having to command the room, that's intimidating to me. And it always has been, and it hasn't always gone well. Right. And so, but I can, through the growth mindset, I know, and if I don't take control of the situation and work to improve it, then, it's just going to be more painful. It's not going to be enjoyable. And here are the things that people do to, get constructive feedback, and talking to, more senior people, who've been through the same experience, and learning about how they, sort of worked to hone their skill. And, it reminds me of just very recently, a student of mine, a doctoral student, we got feedback on a manuscript that we submitted to a journal. And some of the feedback was, quite harsh, and, you didn't do this and la, la, la. And, it's just the nature of the beast. Right. But this was one of her first experiences with this. And she said, I don't know if I'm suited for academia. Maybe I should just wrap up and, go into an industry job. And I said, I'll support you, whatever path you want to choose, but don't make that decision based on just this feedback. I'm like, do you want to see? I can dig up some letters I've gotten. It's just, the way it is. So it helps, so the growth mindset actually enables people to be more open with mistakes they've made in the past, or, sort of challenges that they have faced, and it gets better. And here's how you do it. And, after whatever, your mechanism is for dealing with, critical feedback, whether it be, taking a yoga class, having a glass of wine with friends, whatever it is, you need to have those tools in place. And again, not internalize it. This is not feedback about whether you're a good person, whether you're a good scientist, whether, you have what it takes. Like, we can't, sort of, we take it so beyond what it is, what it is. And even some of the feedback itself, it's like, okay, well, we could actually sit down and look at, go line by line through this. And just because they said it doesn't mean it's true. And so I do think that there's, something with women, there's some evidence of this that, like, for example, applying for a patent and getting getting it rejected. So men are more likely to apply again after an initial rejection, whereas women. So I think there's something that goes on, probably because of how we're socialized and how people think about gender and these gender stereotypes, that, all it takes is one no to be like, oh, and maybe I'm not cut out for this.
That is fascinating. There's so many things in there around, I think an absolute obligation on female leaders to make sure they share the kind of scars and the hard parts about their journey, not make it look easy.
Yeah, that's right.
And, that's interesting when you unwrap all of that, because if we're motivated from a place sometimes of I'll show you, or I'll prove, or whatever, people are less likely to maybe be vulnerable and kind of share that, actually, this was really tough. Perfectionism. And females not, and it probably leads on from what you've just said, but, I don't know whether this is a myth or not, enough people report it, but the fact that men are more likely to go for a job with 2 or 3 of the criteria, and a female won't go even though she's got 8 or 9 and she's perfectly suited. What's going on there?
Well, the deeply ingrained stereotype that what is masculine is good. So we're operating from, sort of an assumption of not good enough, by and large. And then, I'm sure that there's some probably, people have had experiences of maybe I did try, to put myself out there for something where where it was a stretch and somebody laughed in my face, right? So we don't know what the experiences are that led men and women to that, sort of reaction. But yeah. And then also I think that, because we're operating in quote, a man's world, then, to be accepted, I need to check every box. And so there is, and I think young girls are socialized to be perfect, right? To try and be perfect in appearance and, obviously social media and these carefully, crafted images and whatnot. So I do think there's some truth to that. And, we all could work towards, again, like, here's something I'm not good at. And just like practicing sharing that with people in a way that, it's okay. The walls are not crumbling down because I'm not good at PowerPoint.
Yes.
Start small, start admitting things that you're not good at that you don't actually care about, right? And then grow to the things that are, more sort of kind of scare you.
I was really not good at Canva, but I just kept applying myself and applying myself and applying myself.
Yeah.
Okay, so 2017, an article, Changing the Narrative, Women as Negotiators and Leaders.
Yeah.
How do we define masculine and feminine leadership traits in the first place? When people use that kind of language, what are we talking about?
Well, masculine being very assertive, risk-taking, high regard for, self-interest and not willing to go in and tussle and, sort of be hard charging. I think that's a stereotypically masculine way of negotiating. And, in a fixed pie world, right? If we have $100 bill that we're trying to divide up between the two of us, if I'm, pushy and intimidating and, just stubborn, I probably will get more than $50 of it. It's in a very short term sort of zero sum way. But we know that negotiating, that's just a very small part of what negotiating is. Negotiating is also about growing the pie, finding opportunities to make, sort of good trade-offs so that we can get to win-win and we both walk away with something that is important to us. And so these integrative negotiating skills require openness, curiosity, asking the right questions. And so some of my work actually has flipped that stereotype on its head of what it means to be a good negotiator, which people often think of these masculine traits, and said, good negotiators have good listening skills, are verbally communicative, are, open. Just telling people that and then putting men and women into the identical negotiation that we did in those other studies, women actually outperform men. They claim more of the value when they're more confident going into it because those traits resonate with them because it's a stereotype about, feminine skills. I hate to be like men are this way and women are this way. So we can say, even as a stereotype, and we don't even have to connect it to gender, that when you frame negotiation in those terms, which anybody who teaches negotiations is going to tell you, those are in fact traits that are very important, then women are like, I can do this, right?
That negotiation exercise that you take everyone through on the program is very powerful. In terms of everyone learning that one sentence that you put there about negotiating is about increasing the size of the pie. I would consider myself a strong negotiator, and I got good outcomes, but there was so much more that I could have got out of that exercise. So it was absolutely fascinating. Gender deafness. So the women being the only voice in the room and not being listened or heard, that whole concept, it's real. Has your research shown up any ways that women can deal with that?
Well, it's hard, right? So some of it is, related to, ethical standards and, sort of taking into account, again, more than just this short term, we want to, get in and get as much as we possibly can. We also want to create a relationship. We want future business. We want to have, good reputation. So we get referrals, right? So this concern for everybody at the table is something that, just at a young age, on average, women have been socialized to pay more attention to. Part of it is just because we operate within a hierarchy, a social hierarchy, a gender hierarchy, and women tend to be, lower status and lower power. And so we're going to be more vigilant to, sort of other people and what effect these actions are having on them. And so that's actually, so the example we use in that article is about Sally Krawcheck in Citibank. And, she tried speaking up at, around the 2008 financial crisis. They'd done, sort of a deal with clients that ended up losing them a bunch of money. And she argued that, the clients had sort of been misled and that they deserved a refund. And at that time, no one would listen to her, and she, was sort of stripped of her duties. And it was, kind of a tragic ending, but she's now gone on to create, women-centered investment company. And she's a very vocal sort of advocate for women in finance and business. So, I think there's a happy ending to it, but, I think it's about, in my own life, right? Like trying to remind people of let's just not focus on what the upside gains are to taking this risky strategy, but what are the potential downside losses? And is there an alternative that's better? Right. And sometimes, you have to, kind of say, wait a second, let's think through this and not just focus on, sort of confirming, what we hope to be true, but also considering, do we want to be on the front page of the newspaper? Do we want this to get out, in the marketplace more generally, and advocating for a more cautious and, again, integrative approach? I don't think you're going to convince people to say, give up your profits, right, in favor for someone else. But again, through this negotiation mindset of win-win is possible, we can expand the pie. There are other ways to grow our business in ways that we can also, strengthen our relationship with these other parties.
Was it that article that talked about the UN Security Council and the number of women at the table?
I probably did. You have to remind me exactly.
So it was talking about that there were 6 out of 15 females, and a lot of commentary around, the dynamics really changed in terms of the collaboration and those sorts of things. And I guess the change when females left and the balance that people actually called that change out.
Yeah. And that's, a nice, sort of real world example of how, again, because of how we're socialized, having women at the table changes the dynamics at the table. Mm-hmm. And so there's some actual, sort of experimental evidence of this as well, laboratory-based work by Anita Woolley at Carnegie Mellon. And what she found, she was studying what she called collective intelligence, right? So is there a property that emerges in teams that is, some teams are just fundamentally, more, quote, intelligent than other teams. And, obviously it's not just about adding up the IQ of every person at the table, but is there a way in which teams operate that sets them up for success across a variety of different domains, whether it be negotiation, a moral dilemma, brainstorming task, you name it. And she did, in fact, find that some teams were better than others. And what the property was of the teams boiled down to how they interacted together. And so teams that on average did better, no matter what you threw at them, they did better because they had more equal participation of turn taking. Uh-huh. So if there are 5 people at the team, on average, each person was speaking about 20% of the time. Whereas teams that did worse, had 5 people on the team, but 2 people were doing 60 to 80% of the speaking. And one of the best predictors of this equal participation is the number of women at the table.
Wow. There's some really important stuff for leaders to be really digesting. And, I can think of all the people after they've seen this interview going into their workplace and kind of timing.
Well, I know. I want a little meter at all my meetings, right? It's like, you have spoken enough.
Have I had my 20%?
Right.
As well. Okay, so the other thing that I loved out of that article was it was a survey or a question of 64,000 people. Yeah.
And the Athena doctrine.
Yeah, so 2/3 of people agreed that the world would be a better place if women thought like men.
No.
What is
thought like women?
Men. How could I get that the wrong way around? So if men thought like women, what are we?
Freudian slip.
Totally. What are we saying there?
Well, it's, again, I mean, you can ask people, right? We all know the stereotypes, right? Like, so whether every woman is this way or every man is this way, of course, that's not true. Yeah. But if you say, on average, what are women like? And people will say, they're more, sort of accommodating, more willing to take in other perspectives, more give and take, right? And whatnot, cooperative. People say that, yes, that is what the world needs more of. Not the things that we associate with masculinity. And that's not to say that we don't need assertiveness and risk-taking and all of those things, but because the world has largely been run by men for a very long time, and we all can look around us and see, whether it's climate change or war or, you name it, we all know that we need to correct course. Mm. And what people are saying across the globe is that we need more of that feminine style of leadership.
Laura, your most recent, it might not be your most recent, but it was 2021. So a gender gap in managerial span of control, implications for the gender pay gap, is fascinating. Would you share that? Because gender pay gap seems to be an ongoing significant challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was really exciting project for me because I was able to take real world data from a large, sort of alumni sample of MBA graduates. So thinking, people coming out of the identical graduate program, elite graduate program, and tracking their career progression over, a 20-year span of time. And what we were able to do is identify all the things that would predict compensation. So this is, a very carefully constructed, detailed survey that alumni filled out through a consulting firm that the school partners with. And, as you would predict, more years out, right? Higher pay, certain industries pay more than others. There are certain characteristics of jobs. We also had information about, these alumni, like what job did they have before they came to business school? What was their compensation? What was their GPA? So we've got individual characteristics, job characteristics, geographic location, everything under the sun that you could think of as being important for compensation. And we identified something that no one had ever really looked at before, which is, the number of direct reports that people have. And what we found is that, again, even though this is a relatively homogeneous population because they all made the same decision to go to the same school and get the same education, men had far more, almost twice as many direct reports as women did. And this started very early on. They start as individual contributors, and then they become managers. And, women are on average, let's say they have 2 direct reports, men have 4. Right. Then they move to the director level. Let's say women have 6 direct reports, men have 9. And this kept fanning out as they moved from director to VP, even in the C-suite. And of course, the number of direct reports you have is related to compensation. And so that was sort of the finding in the real world. And then I combined that real world data with experiments to try and understand, again, is there something going on? Or do people associate, men with leading larger teams? And why would that be so? And what are the implications? And so with Margaret Lee, a postdoc at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership, we found that, in fact, people think that men are better suited for leading large teams because they're more, what we call authority ranking. They're more directive. They're more, top down. Whereas women are better suited for leading small teams because we're more communal sharing. We're more, sort of democratic, and, everybody pitches in, and, and then separately. So people who would never say, I think men should be paid more than women, will say men are better suited for these kinds of jobs. And separately, these kinds of jobs are more difficult, and so they should be paid more.
Wow, another lens on it. Is there anything in there that backs up the belief that men are better leading larger teams and women are better leading smaller teams?
We have no evidence of that. We asked them, we have a separate project. So there's demand side explanations and supply side explanations. The demand side being this, sort of stereotypes and beliefs about who's suited. Then we're studying supply side, like, do women want to lead teams as large as men? Yes. And in fact, What we're finding is that they have the same aspirations as men. Okay. So they both say, in a perfect world, I would have about 11 direct reports, and men are actually getting to 11. Women are getting to around 7.
Mm.
So now, again, we can take a step back and say, maybe it is harder for women to lead a larger team if they get pushback every time they try and be directive and, say, I need you to do this, right? So there's evidence, Modupe Akinola at Columbia and others have studied, women are less likely to delegate, right? And again, you have to ask yourself, why is that? What experiences have they had along the way trying to delegate, and what reactions have they had? And has that led them to say, it's just easier for me to do this myself?
That's fascinating, because in the first series, one of the things that came out from a lot of people was a sort of pattern of over responsibility that women have about wanting to not have anyone else feel overburdened with work. You'd rather kind of take it on yourself and drown.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's, again, the perfectionism, the not wanting to impose on others. So it's so complex. And that's why, again, it comes down to, we all need to be self-aware and we need to lean in, so to speak, but also we have to, as a system, be monitoring these differences and make sure, because it wasn't the case that leading a larger team, translated into more hours worked per week. It's not, because you have some people helping you.
That's right. Really smart people.
Yes.
Laura, what do you feel optimistic about?
I feel optimistic that these conversations are happening, and increasingly men are interested in engaging in these conversations. And I also am optimistic, as much as, this entire conversation has mainly been about women and the challenges we face. There's also just this growing, sort of interest in, whether you call it toxic masculinity or masculinity contests in organizations, and, just really encouraging men to be self-reflective and to question some of the cultural messages that they have about, what it means to be a real man. And again, through the growth mindset, if we start thinking about growth mindsets in terms of gender roles in society, then we see, when men adopt a growth mindset, like, there's no reason why, women need to, do the dishes or what have you. All these different roles and responsibilities, men and women are equally suited to take on. And what we find is that men are less defensive. They're less, sort of likely to rationalize inequality. And we find with the growth mindset about gender roles that women subjectively experience less like work-family conflict when they have a growth mindset. as opposed to a fixed mindset. So I think the growth mindset, expanding our conversation and being just as curious about men and trying to nudge them in a more healthy and productive direction, that gives me optimism.
I love what you've said there. I've got 5 wonderful men in this series, and one of them operates a business called The Man Cave, and they work with adolescents from 12 to 16, and they focus on toxic masculinity. And together, he and I explored, or I asked him, what does a good man look like in 2021? Because I think that's difficult for people. Laura, the final question I ask of everybody in the series is, from your perspective, what does brave feminine leadership look like? And do you think that needs to change?
Well, I love the word brave, and I love feminine, and I love leadership. So, brave is really about speaking your truth, right? And that truth sometimes bubbles up and just in terms of a gut reaction to, that doesn't ring true to me. I don't, that doesn't, you don't know everything, right? So sort of this questioning the status quo, and, bravery is courage, is like speaking through the heart, right? And just thinking outside the box and not being, being an independent thinker and being willing to speak your truth. And that's not to say that there aren't sometimes consequences and costs for doing so, but not, sort of allowing that to stop you, right? Because for me, that's like what living a life of meaning and purpose is about. And so I don't think it needs to change. I just think we need to grow that muscle, and really keep it alive.
I've loved our conversation, and I would be guessing at this stage that your decision to focus part of your work on gender has not ruined your career.
Well, yeah, I'm still standing.
Absolutely fabulous to have you join the conversation, Laura. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And, I encourage everybody to jump into that research. There's some fantastic questions that you're asking. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. This is a ton of fun. And I'm really so glad that you're doing this, and such a gift to the world. So thank you.